Well, for more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Lazarus Nanzala, who's the Oxfam Africa Food Systems and Climate Justice Advisor. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Peter, for having me on the program. And it's a pleasure to speak to you again.
It's disappointing that African governments continue to fail to live up to their promises, particularly around agriculture. I remember they came to an agreement in Mozambique many years ago, committing, was it 10% of budgets towards agriculture? But that's never really happened, has it?
True, and you really quoted it right. When they met, is precisely almost now 20 years since they made that declaration to try and spend around 10% of their public expenditure on agriculture. But that has never materialized. To the contrary, a report that was released, a biannual report that was released by the African Union this past year in the last AU General Assembly, showed that only one country, and that is Rwanda, was on course to meeting the overall CAADP, Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Investment Framework targets out of the 55 member states, including those who did not report. Of course, I'm adding them there. And this is quite traumatizing, Peter, for the continent that has, as shown by the African Development Bank, 65% of the arable, unfarmed arable land. And it also has its GDP driven by agricultural production, of course, so for a few countries. So it's quite unfortunate. And as Oxfam, in this ongoing assembly, we have called on African leaders to walk through their promises. But as you said, we understand their leaders, they are political, they promise a lot and achieve less, but it should not to this level where we have 20 million of our people going through hunger and many more. The situation is not even much going to be better in the coming years.
What have the authorities been saying why they haven't been living up to these promises and yet spending billions on arms?
Yeah, and that's the contradiction, isn't it, Peter? That even we brought up in our in many of our reports that we have done through the year, is that investment in other sectors that are not important. And I'll just take you back to 2020 and through the themes of the year. One of the themes of the year, for example, in 2020 was silencing the guns. And I don't know if that has been the contributor of some of these budget increases in defense, but the reports that are coming out, even some that are commissioned by the governments themselves, show disjointness when it comes to the sector that is very critical to people's being, especially the agriculture sector and the production. And in this past year, and the year of nutrition, for example, it was a year that we saw as hope for the continent, where governments committed to ending malnutrition. But what we have also, the trend we have seen is that governments do not follow through investing in, and we have been asking ourselves and telling them not to make this a talk show. And in this year, and I've seen even in the interview before this, you are speaking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and it's quite a good thing. And this year, they say that's where they are going to focus their energy on. But nothing is coming out. Nobody's talking about the people that are going hungry on this continent, or the people who are producing food that is enough to feed people in the same country, but they don't have access to the market in a way that that food can be able to help their fellow citizens or even their fellow comrades across the continent. And to your question specifically, to be honest, nothing concrete is coming from these leaders, and we have been listening to them today, and I'm sure they're in the closing plenary tomorrow. None of them is speaking specifically of the issues that are affecting people on the ground, especially hunger in the many regions that we come from.
In the meantime, your report talks about 20 million more people facing hunger. I remember a report that you came out with in October last year about the drought-stricken part of East Africa. Something like you were expecting somebody to die every 36 seconds, if I remember, from hunger. Is this where we are, where we're going to see more and more people perhaps dying of hunger if efforts are not doubled?
Yeah, and I link this to the conversation we had, Peter, you remember when I was just heading to the conference, the COP, the climate change negotiations in Egypt. This is linked. And since that report in October, nothing has changed. In fact, the latest reports show that it has gone worse. The situation is still that more and more people are dying of hunger because the seasonal rains have failed since October last year. And the Horn of Africa, for example, the Sahel, is now experiencing one of its worst droughts again still. But what we are also seeing from the government is that, for example, in Kenya, they declared a state of emergency, and across many other regions, Somalia is still facing the same situation. But the governments are not putting in effort to help build the resilience of the communities, investing inwards. To the contrary, we are seeing other priorities overtaking the same sector in terms of making sure that these people even have food for their next session. And there are many other ways that this impact is not even the people who are dying and being buried to the ground. There are many other young children who cannot be able to go to school, young children who are getting stunted. And in one of that framework, that African governments committed to, one of the key deliverables is to reduce the level of stuntedness among children under 5. That has not happened. And if we are facing this situation of hunger, then we're even killing more people alive than those we are burying in the ground. Because if young children cannot get enough food and live a healthy life, then what are we looking up to in the coming years? Of course, as I mentioned, there is the issue of climate that sometimes is beyond the level of some of these nations to really invest in and adapt. But it can never be an excuse. When we listened again to these leaders, even in the opening remarks, climate is still a highlight of their discussion, but it cannot be an excuse of increasing their budgets in defense, for example, and not investing in a sector that is very critical to their population.
We've run out of time, but perhaps one final quick question. Do you think that there's a lethargy because we've almost become aid dependent in many parts of the continent where we know we're going to get bailed out and therefore there's a less urgent action to deal with some of these issues?
If I were to take a very lenient language, I'll say yes, but I think it's quite unfortunate and quite embarrassing for the continent. And there has been talk, for example, of the Ukraine crisis and hitting and disrupting global supply chain. But we should not be looking forward for external funding to be able to support long-term. In the medium term, yes, we need resources for aid to go to those people and save lives. But in the long term, if we were to look long-term, then African countries and African leaders need to be more serious, and they need to invest more in sustainable production and making sure that some of these goods can easily move across borders so that we are saving a generation going forward, because climate change is going to be with us for quite a long time in the future. Reversing whatever we have done will take a lot of time. And the continent that will be most impacted is Africa, and we cannot afford to be lazy on our own investment and depend on others to bail us out.
Lazarus, that's where we'll leave it. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Peter. Much appreciated. Good evening.
Good evening. All right, that's Lazarus Nanzala, who's Oxfam Africa Food Systems and Climate Justice Advisor, talking to us about this lack of investment in agriculture on the continent. And as a result, we're seeing 20 million more people falling into hunger on the continent.